I remember the exact moment my family decided I was weak, even though no one had the courage to say it directly to my face. It started quietly, the way these things often do, with small looks passed across the dinner table and hushed conversations that stopped the second I entered the room. People think older women stop noticing things after a certain age, like our senses slowly dim the way an old light bulb flickers before going out. But the truth is the opposite. When you've lived as long as I have, you notice everything. You hear the tone beneath someone's voice. You recognize the difference between kindness and pity, and you understand when the people you raise begin looking at you like you've already faded into the background of your own life. That evening I was sitting in my usual chair beside the kitchen window, stirring sugar into a cup of tea that had already gone lukewarm. My son Mark sat across the table rubbing his temples as he complained about bills again. His wife Linda barely looked up from her phone while he talked, her thumbs moving quickly across the screen like whatever she was reading mattered more than the people in the room. My grandson Ethan sat quietly between them, pretending to focus on his plate while the tension stretched across the table like a rope pulled too tight. For a long moment nobody spoke to me at all, and that silence told me more than any words ever could. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a family enjoying dinner together. It was the kind that appears when people are carefully deciding how to say something unpleasant without sounding cruel. I watched them with calm eyes, letting them think my thoughts were somewhere far away. Finally, Mark cleared his throat and leaned back in his chair like a man preparing for an important announcement. "Mom," he began slowly, his voice coated with that strained politeness people use when they're trying to sound caring. "You really should start taking it easier these days." Linda nodded immediately, as if the sentence had been rehearsed between them long before dinner started. "He's right," she added casually without even looking at me. "You're not as strong as you used to be, Martha." The words floated across the table and settled in the room like dust. Mark sighed as if he had finally said something he'd been holding inside for months. "We just worry about you," he continued, though the concern in his voice felt thin and rehearsed. I took a slow sip of my tea before answering, giving myself a moment to study their faces carefully. Mark looked tired in the way people do when life isn't turning out the way they expected. Linda's expression carried that familiar hint of impatience she wore whenever the conversation didn't revolve around her plans. Ethan glanced between all of us, his young eyes quietly trying to understand the strange tension filling the room. I set my cup down gently on the table so it wouldn't clink against the saucer. "I've been taking care of this house for more than 40 years, I said calmly. "I think I can handle one more evening." Mark shook his head slowly, as if I had completely missed the point he was trying to make. "That's exactly what I mean," he replied with a tired laugh. "You don't realize how much things have changed." The way he said it made it sound like I was the only one in the room who didn't understand reality anymore. Linda finally looked up from her phone then, giving me a sympathetic smile that felt colder than silence. The truth was things had changed, just not in the way they believed. A year earlier, after my husband Harold passed away, this same conversation would have sounded completely different. Back then, Mark's voice was full of concern when he suggested I shouldn't live alone in the house anymore. He said he worried about me being by myself after everything I'd been through. The house felt too quiet without Harold's laughter echoing down the hallway. I remember standing in the living room that afternoon while Mark explained how it would be better if he, Linda, and Ethan moved in with me. At the time, his suggestion felt like love wrapped in practicality. I told myself it would bring life back into the empty rooms Harold and I once filled with family dinners and Sunday music. So I agreed without hesitation. I believed my son was simply trying to take care of his mother the way a good son should. Looking back now, I realized that moment was when everything quietly began to shift. The first few months after they moved in seemed harmless enough on the surface. Linda rearranged the kitchen cabinets, saying it would make cooking easier for everyone. Mark insisted on handling the household bills so I wouldn't have to worry about complicated paperwork anymore. Each change came with a polite explanation that sounded reasonable if you didn't look too closely, but small changes have a way of growing when nobody questions them. One day, I noticed Harold's old toolbox had disappeared from the garage. Mark said he needed the space for exercise equipment because he was trying to get healthier. Another afternoon, I realized Linda had packed away several of Harold's favorite photographs from the living room shelves. She said the frames looked outdated and didn't match the new decorations she planned to buy. Every time I asked about something that had quietly vanished, I received the same gentle response. You don't need to worry about that anymore. They repeated it so often that the sentence began to feel like a curtain slowly closing around my life. That evening at dinner, the same curtain seemed to be drawing tighter. Mark stood up and began stacking plates like he had already decided the conversation was finished. Linda stretched her arms above her head with a long sigh, clearly satisfied with how the discussion had unfolded. You should get some rest, Martha, she said while walking toward the sink. We'll handle everything from here. I nodded slowly and pushed my chair back from the table. Ethan watched me as I stood, his expression carrying the quiet uncertainty of someone who senses something unfair happening but doesn't yet know how to stop it. Good night, Grandma, he said softly as I walked past him. His voice held a warmth that reminded me not everyone in the house had forgotten who I was. Good night, sweetheart, I replied gently. Then I turned and made my way toward the staircase, listening to the faint murmur of Mark and Linda's voices starting up again behind me. When I reached my bedroom upstairs, I closed the door quietly and sat down at Harold's old writing desk near the window. The lamp cast a soft golden circle across the polished wood surface, illuminating a small leather notebook resting beside a fountain pen. I opened the notebook slowly and ran my fingers across the pages filled with neat lines of handwriting. Inside were months of careful notes I had been keeping since the day Mark and his family moved into the house. Every conversation that seemed unusual, every financial decision Mark said he would take care of, every time Linda suggested I might be getting forgetful. The pages were filled with dates, small observations, and quiet reminders to myself. Not because I was confused about what was happening, quite the opposite. I wrote everything down because I understood exactly what was unfolding around me. People who underestimate you often reveal far more than they realize. I picked up the pen and added another entry at the bottom of the most recent page. September 12, I wrote carefully in steady handwriting. Mark suggested I stop managing the house. Linda agreed. The ink dried quickly under the warm light of the lamp. For a moment I sat there listening to the faint sounds drifting up from downstairs. Mark's voice carried through the floorboards, followed by Linda's familiar laugh. They sounded comfortable, almost relieved, as if they believed the conversation at dinner had settled something important. I closed the notebook and leaned back in the chair, letting the quiet settle around me. Harold used to say the strongest people in the world aren't always the loudest ones. Real strength often looks like patience. It looks like someone watching carefully while everyone else assumes the story is already over. Downstairs I heard Linda say something that made Mark chuckle. A moment later his voice rose just enough for the words to reach my ears through the thin wooden floor. She's getting weaker every year, he said casually. Linda murmured something in agreement that I couldn't quite make out. I sat very still at the desk for a moment, letting those words settle in the quiet room. Then, slowly, a small smile appeared on my face. They believed weakness looked like silence. They believed patience meant surrender. What they didn't know was that silence can be the strongest shield a person carries. It gives you time to watch, time to understand, time to prepare for the moment when the truth finally rises to the surface where everyone can see it clearly. And when that moment came, the people sitting around that dinner table would realize something they had completely forgotten. The house was quiet later that night, the kind of quiet that only settles in after everyone believes the day's finished and nothing important remains to happen. I stayed at Harold's desk long after the lights downstairs had gone out, letting the silence stretch around me while the small notebook rested beneath my hand. The pages inside it were beginning to feel heavier every day, not because of the paper, but because of what they represented. Each line was a memory I refused to let anyone rewrite. People think the elderly forget things easily, that time somehow erases details from our minds. What they never understand is that time actually sharpens memory. When you live long enough, you begin to recognize patterns in people. You see how kindness slowly shifts into control when someone believes you're too tired to push back. That was the pattern unfolding inside my own home, and I was watching every step of it carefully. The next morning began like most mornings had since Mark and his family moved in. I woke before sunrise, the habit of a lifetime refusing to disappear simply because someone else believed I should slow down. The early air drifting through the open window carried the faint scent of roses from the garden Harold had planted decades earlier. I stood there for a moment looking at the soft grey sky and remembering the mornings we used to share coffee on the back porch before the rest of the world woke up. Harold always said a quiet morning was the best way to start the day because it reminded you that peace still existed somewhere in the world. I held on to that thought as I walked downstairs, the wooden steps creaking gently beneath my feet the same way they had for 40 years. In the kitchen, I began preparing breakfast the way I always had. The smell of coffee filled the room while the skillet warmed slowly on the stove. Cooking had always been my way of caring for the people in my life, and I refused to give it up just because someone else believed I should. By the time Mark wandered into the kitchen, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, the table was already set. He stopped in the doorway like the sight had caught him off guard. "Mom," he said with a small frown, "you didn't have to do all this." I kept my voice calm while I slid a plate onto the table. "I know I didn't have to," I replied. "I wanted to." He glanced toward the hallway as if expecting Linda to appear and confirm that the situation needed correcting. A moment later, Linda did enter the kitchen, her hair still messy from sleep, but her expression already carrying that familiar hint of irritation. She looked from the table to me and then back to Mark. "You shouldn't be standing over a stove this early," she said flatly. "You could hurt yourself." The comment was delivered in the same tone someone might use when scolding a child who had wandered too close to traffic. I set the coffee pot down gently and met her eyes. "I've been cooking since before you were born," I said quietly. Linda crossed her arms, clearly unimpressed by the statement. Mark shifted uncomfortably beside her. "She just means you should take it easy," he added quickly, trying to smooth the moment over before it turned into an argument. Ethan came into the kitchen then, his backpack slung over one shoulder and his hair sticking up in the careless way teenage boys rarely notice. His face brightened slightly when he saw the breakfast spread across the table. "Smells amazing, Grandma," he said while dropping into a chair. That simple sentence warmed something inside my chest that had been slowly cooling over the past year. Linda opened her mouth like she wanted to say something about the food, but Ethan had already started eating before she could interrupt. For a brief moment, the room felt almost normal again. Mark poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down, though the thoughtful look on his face told me something was still on his mind. I recognized that look well enough to know the morning's peace wouldn't last long. Sure enough, halfway through breakfast, Mark cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly. "Mom," he began carefully, "I've been thinking about something." Linda glanced at him approvingly, clearly aware of the topic he was about to raise. I folded my hands on the table and waited. "Managing a house this size can be overwhelming," he continued, "especially for someone who's been through as much as you have lately." I noticed how he avoided using the word old, even though it hovered in the air between us. "So Linda and I were talking last night," he said, "and we think it might be better if we start handling the financial side of things completely." Ethan stopped eating and looked up slowly, sensing the shift in the conversation even if he didn't fully understand it. I felt the familiar weight of their expectations pressing gently against the moment. They believed this was another small decision that would pass without resistance. Mark continued speaking as if the matter were already settled. "You wouldn't have to worry about bills or taxes or anything complicated anymore," he said reassuringly. "We'd just take care of it for you." Linda nodded beside him like a quiet echo of his words. I watched them both for a long second before answering. "You already handle most of those things," I said calmly. Mark gave a quick smile. "Exactly. This would just make it official." He said the last word with careful emphasis, as though formality somehow made the idea safer. Ethan looked from his father to me with a crease forming between his eyebrows. "Grandma's always handled everything before," he said quietly. Linda gave him a quick glance that suggested he should stay out of the conversation. Mark sighed, clearly irritated by the interruption. "Things change, Ethan," he said. "People get older." The room fell silent after that sentence. I could see Ethan struggling to understand why the word older sounded so much like weaker when it left his father's mouth. I reached across the table and patted his hand gently before standing to clear the dishes. "Thank you for your concern," I said to Mark and Linda without raising my voice. "I'll think about what you said." The rest of the morning passed with a strange heaviness hanging in the air. Mark left for work shortly after breakfast, still believing the conversation had simply been postponed rather than refused. Linda spent most of the afternoon on her phone in the living room, occasionally glancing toward me as if she expected some dramatic reaction. I gave her none. Instead, I moved through the house quietly, completing small tasks that had once been second nature to me. Dusting shelves, watering plants, folding laundry. Each ordinary chore felt like a reminder that this house had been my responsibility long before anyone else claimed authority over it. By late afternoon, the sun had shifted across the windows, casting long golden lines across the floorboards Harold had installed with his own hands. That evening, I returned to the writing desk once again. The leather notebook waited exactly where I had left it the night before. I opened to a fresh page and began writing slowly, letting each word settle with careful clarity. September 13, I wrote. Mark suggested taking full control of finances. My pen paused for a moment before continuing. Linda agreed immediately. I closed the notebook after finishing the entry and rested my hand on the cover. Downstairs, I could hear Linda speaking on the phone to someone, her voice carrying faintly through the floor. She was laughing about something, though I couldn't make out the words. For a moment, I simply listened to the distant sound of that laughter and wondered how long they truly believed this quiet arrangement would last. The following week unfolded with a quiet rhythm that might have looked peaceful to anyone watching from the outside, but inside the walls of the house, something subtle was shifting. Mark and Linda had grown more confident after the breakfast conversation, as though my calm response had been a silent agreement instead of the careful pause it truly was. They moved through the house with the casual authority of people who believe the future had already been decided. I noticed the change in small ways at first. Mark began taking phone calls about the property while standing in the living room instead of stepping outside like he used to. Linda started making comments about renovations she wanted to do someday, speaking about the house as if it already belonged to them completely. They never said anything openly cruel, but the assumption behind their words was impossible to miss. One afternoon, I was watering the roses along the back fence when Linda stepped onto the porch holding her phone and a cup of iced coffee. The sun was warm on my shoulders, and the scent of the flowers Harold planted years ago drifted through the garden. For a moment, I allowed myself to enjoy the quiet. Then Linda's voice broke through it. "You shouldn't be bending over like that," she called from the porch railing. "You could hurt your back." I straightened slowly and turned toward her, wiping a little dirt from my hands onto my gardening gloves. "These roses have been my responsibility for 20 years, I said calmly. "I think they'll survive one more afternoon." She gave a small shrug that suggested the conversation wasn't worth continuing. Still, I noticed how she watched me for a moment longer before going back inside. Later that evening, Ethan found me in the garden again, just as the sun was beginning to sink behind the houses across the street. He dropped his backpack near the porch and walked over to the flower beds with quiet curiosity. "Grandma," he said softly, crouching beside one of the bushes, "why do these roses look different from the ones in the front yard?" I smiled a little at the question. "Because your grandfather planted these himself," I explained. "He always said the backyard deserves something beautiful too." Ethan nodded thoughtfully while examining one of the deep red blooms. For a moment we worked side by side in comfortable silence. Then he glanced toward the house and lowered his voice. "Dad talks about the house a lot lately," he said, "like it's already his." The honesty in his tone surprised me, though I shouldn't have been shocked that he noticed more than his parents realized. I sat down slowly on the small wooden bench near the garden path and brushed a bit of soil from my skirt. Ethan joined me, leaning his elbows on his knees while he looked out at the yard. "Your father has always liked feeling in control," I said gently. "Some people think control makes them safe." Ethan frowned slightly. "Does it?" he asked. I shook my head once. "Not always." The breeze carried the soft rustle of leaves through the trees, while the sky above us turned a warm shade of orange. For a moment the world felt peaceful again, the way it used to when Harold was alive. Ethan broke the silence after a minute. "You're not weak, you know," he said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried a sincerity that settled deep inside my chest. That night, after everyone went to bed, I returned to my desk again and opened the notebook that had become my silent companion. The pages were filling faster now, each entry marking another small moment where my son and his wife assumed they had already won a quiet battle I hadn't agreed to fight. I wrote carefully under the dim glow of the desk lamp. September 18. Mark discussing house matters on phone again. Beneath that, I added another line. Linda planning renovations. The ink flowed smoothly across the page as my hand moved with steady patience. Writing everything down wasn't about revenge or anger. It was about clarity. Truth has a way of getting twisted when people rely on memory alone. I had learned long ago that the best defense against confusion was documentation. The next morning began with another conversation I suspected had been planned long before I entered the kitchen. Mark and Linda were already seated at the table when I came downstairs, both of them wearing the same carefully neutral expressions they used whenever they wanted to present something as reasonable. Mark gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Mom, can we talk for a minute?" he asked. I sat down slowly and folded my hands in my lap. Linda slid a folder across the table toward me with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We've been looking into ways to make things easier for everyone," she explained. Mark nodded as if to confirm her statement. "It's just some paperwork," he said casually. "Nothing complicated." I opened the folder and glanced at the first page. Even without reading every word, I recognized the language immediately. Power of attorney documents were not something you forgot once you had seen them before. My eyes moved calmly across the printed lines while Mark continued speaking. "This would just give us the ability to handle financial matters if you ever needed help," he said reassuringly. Linda leaned forward slightly. "It's really for your protection," she added quickly. I looked up from the papers and met both of their expectant faces. They were watching me with the quiet anticipation of people who believe the outcome was obvious. The moment stretched across the table for several long seconds before I finally closed the folder. "I appreciate the thought," I said evenly. Mark relaxed slightly, clearly interpreting my tone as agreement. Linda's shoulders loosened as well, but then I placed the folder gently back on the table between us. "However," I continued, "I'm not ready to sign anything today." Mark blinked in surprise. "Why not?" he asked, the frustration already creeping into his voice. I kept my expression calm. "Because decisions like this deserve careful consideration." Linda exchanged a quick glance with him. "It's just paperwork, Martha," she insisted. I shook my head once. "Exactly," I replied quietly, "and paperwork can change more than people realize." The rest of the conversation dissolved into an awkward silence after that. Mark eventually stood up and muttered something about needing to leave for work. Linda gathered the papers back into the folder with a tight smile that barely concealed her irritation. Ethan watched the entire exchange from the doorway, his expression thoughtful. As the front door closed behind his parents, he looked at me and raised his eyebrows slightly. I simply returned his gaze with a small, knowing smile. Some battles are not meant to be fought loudly in the moment. Sometimes the strongest move is simply refusing to rush. That evening, when I opened my notebook again, I wrote another careful entry beneath the previous ones. September 19th. Mark and Linda presented power of attorney documents. I paused before adding the final line. Declined to sign. Then I closed the notebook and rested my hand on its cover for a moment. Downstairs, I could hear Mark pacing across the living room floor while speaking quietly to Linda about something I couldn't quite make out. Their voices carried the restless edge of people who were suddenly realizing their plan might take longer than they expected. The tension in the house changed after that morning at the kitchen table. It was subtle at first, the kind of change you feel before you can fully explain it. Mark and Linda were still polite when they spoke to me, but the warmth had quietly disappeared from their voices. Their smiles had become thinner, their patience shorter. It was as though my refusal to sign those papers had unsettled something they thought was already settled. I moved through the house the same way I always had, calmly completing small daily routines, but I could feel their eyes following me more often now. People behave differently when they believe someone has stepped outside the role they expected them to play. 2 days later, I was in the living room dusting the bookshelf when Mark came home earlier than usual. He dropped his keys on the table with a sharp clatter and loosened his tie as he walked in. I noticed the crease between his eyebrows, the same one he used to wear as a child when something hadn't gone his way. "Mom," he said, his voice already carrying frustration before I even answered. "Can we talk again?" I set the cloth down slowly and turned to face him. "Of course," I replied. Linda appeared in the doorway a moment later, clearly aware the conversation was about to begin again. She leaned against the wall with her arms crossed, watching both of us carefully. Mark took a deep breath, like a man trying to stay calm while explaining something obvious. "I don't understand why you're making this complicated," he said. "The paperwork we showed you would make everything easier." I folded my hands together and listened without interrupting. "You wouldn't have to worry about anything anymore," he continued. "Linda and I could manage the finances completely." His voice carried a note of impatience now, as if my hesitation was a personal inconvenience. I held his gaze quietly. "And why exactly is that necessary right now?" I asked. The question hung in the air longer than he expected. Linda answered before he could. "Because things happen, Martha," she said with a forced smile. "People forget things or get confused about bills." The implication behind her words was as clear as if she had said it outright. Mark nodded quickly beside her. "We're just trying to plan ahead," he added. I tilted my head slightly, studying them both. "Planning ahead is wise," I said calmly, "but signing away legal authority isn't something I do without understanding every detail." Mark's shoulders stiffened. "It's standard paperwork," he insisted. "There's nothing complicated about it." I noticed the way Linda's eyes flicked briefly toward him before returning to me. I walked over to the sofa and sat down slowly, gesturing for them to do the same. Mark hesitated for a moment before lowering himself into the chair across from me. Linda remained standing in the doorway, her posture tense. "Tell me something, Mark," I said quietly. "When did you start worrying that I couldn't manage my own life?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "That's not what I said," he replied quickly. I held up a gentle hand to stop the explanation. "Maybe not in those exact words," I continued, "but the idea has been floating around this house for months now." Linda shifted uncomfortably where she stood. Mark rubbed the back of his neck and sighed. "You're reading too much into this," he said. "We just want to help." I watched him carefully, remembering the small boy who used to run through this same living room, chasing his toy trucks across the carpet. "Help usually begins with asking," I replied softly, not assuming. The room fell silent after that. Linda finally stepped forward and perched on the arm of the chair beside Mark. "You're being defensive," she said. "No one is trying to take anything from you." I noticed how quickly she had chosen those exact words. For a moment I simply looked at both of them. Then I stood and walked over to the window, pulling the curtain aside to glance out at the quiet street. The late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the yard Harold once cared for so proudly. "This house has seen a lot of years," I said thoughtfully. "It's watched people grow up, fall down, start over again." Mark shifted in his chair, clearly impatient with the direction the conversation was taking. "Mom," he interrupted, "this isn't about the house's history." I turned back toward him slowly. "Isn't it?" I asked. Neither of them answered right away. The silence stretched long enough for the tension in the room to settle heavily between us. Finally, Mark stood up, frustration written clearly across his face. "Fine," he said with a tired wave of his hand. "Think about it longer if you want." Linda stood as well, though her expression had hardened. "But sooner or later you're going to realize we're right," she added quietly. I didn't argue with that statement. Instead, I simply nodded once and let them walk away toward the kitchen. The sound of their low voices followed them down the hallway as they began whispering to each other again. Later that evening, Ethan knocked gently on my bedroom door. I was sitting at Harold's desk once more with the notebook open in front of me. "Come in," I called softly. He stepped inside and leaned against the doorframe, studying the pages for a moment before speaking. "They're upset," he said. I gave a small smile. "I noticed." Ethan hesitated before asking the question that had clearly been on his mind. "Are they trying to take the house?" I looked at him carefully, impressed by the way his mind was already connecting the pieces. "I don't know exactly what they're trying to do yet," I replied honestly, "but I do know they're in a hurry for something." Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the answer with a seriousness beyond his age. "Dad's been talking about money a lot lately," he said quietly. "More than usual." I closed the notebook gently and rested my hands on the desk. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "But you don't need to worry about adult problems." Ethan gave a small shrug. "It's hard not to when they're happening in the same house," he said. After he left the room, I opened the notebook again and wrote another entry beneath the previous one. September 22. Mark insisted again on power of attorney. I paused before adding the final line. Linda appears increasingly impatient. The pen moves steadily across the page, recording each small detail exactly as it happened. Outside my bedroom window, the sky had turned dark, and the lights from neighboring houses flickered on one by one. I closed the notebook slowly and placed it back inside the desk drawer. The house was quiet again now, but the quiet felt different than it had a week earlier. Something beneath the surface was beginning to push forward, something neither Mark nor Linda fully understood yet. Downstairs I heard them talking again, their voices low but tense. I couldn't make out every word, but one sentence floated clearly up through the floorboards. "She's being stubborn," Linda said sharply. Mark replied with a tired sigh. I recognized all too well. "We'll figure something out," he muttered. I sat back in the chair and let their voices fade into the background. People who believe they are in control often start making mistakes when things don't go according to plan. The next morning I woke to the smell of brewed coffee and the faint hum of a lawnmower outside. It was early, too early for Mark and Linda to have started anything, which meant someone else was awake. I got up and pulled back the curtain, spotting Ethan in the yard, his small hands gripping the handles of the wheelbarrow as he tried to move a pile of leaves. The boy had always been steady for his age, cautious yet determined, and today was no exception. I smiled quietly, recognizing the familiar rhythm of responsibility he'd inherited in part from watching both of us navigate this household for so many years. It reminded me that even amidst tension, life moves forward quietly, with small steps and unseen diligence. I dressed quickly and descended the stairs, careful not to make a sound. Ethan looked up, his face lighting with a mixture of surprise and pride. "Good morning, Grandma," he said softly. I nodded, stepping outside and adjusting my cardigan against the morning chill. "Morning, Ethan. Need a hand?" He shrugged, brushing a strand of hair from his eyes. "I think I've got it, but you can check the flower beds after." I laughed quietly, the sound blending with the rustle of the leaves. There was a rhythm to this morning, a normalcy that seemed to defy the tension still lingering in the air. It was mine, and I intended to keep it. After a while, we moved to the small garden behind the house. Ethan began digging carefully around the marigolds, loosening soil that had hardened under the sun's harsh grip. I knelt beside him, my knees aching but nothing more than a reminder of decades well lived. "Remember," I said, "plants need patience. You can't rush them, no matter how badly you want them to bloom." Ethan nodded seriously, placing the roots gently into the soil, covering them and patting them down with care. I watched, thinking of the family inside the house, unaware that their carefully laid plans were quietly unraveling. Sometimes, the most powerful resistance is the kind that grows slowly, quietly, unseen by those who think they hold all the cards. By mid-morning, Mark appeared on the front porch, holding a clipboard and wearing a frown that suggested frustration rather than concern. I didn't flinch at the sight of him. Ethan continued working, unfazed, and I decided to let him make the first move. "Mom," Mark called, his voice tighter than usual, "we need to talk about the house paperwork again." I didn't respond immediately, letting the words linger in the morning air. He stepped closer, clearly expecting me to yield as he always assumed. "It's really for your own good," he added quickly, hoping to convince me with the familiar line. I simply watched him, standing calmly beside Ethan, letting the boy's quiet diligence contrast sharply with the tension radiating from Mark. "Mark," I said finally, in a voice smooth and steady, "there is no rush for what is already mine. What you believe is necessary is nothing more than a plan built on assumptions." He blinked, as if the words themselves were unfamiliar to him, then opened his mouth to argue. I held up a hand. "Let me finish. I am capable. I am aware. And I do not act on impulse, nor do I relinquish my rights to convenience." Ethan looked up at me with wide eyes, sensing the gravity in my tone. Mark's jaw tightened, and for the first time in many weeks, I noticed a hesitation, a subtle uncertainty in his posture. Linda stepped onto the porch as well, her arms folded and lips pressed into a thin line. "Martha, you're being difficult," she said, attempting her usual calm veneer. I smiled faintly, letting the words wash over me. Perhaps, I replied. Or perhaps I am being cautious, which is always preferable to blind agreement. She shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the script she had rehearsed countless times was failing to produce the expected outcome. Her eyes flicked to Ethan, noting his quiet engagement with the garden, and then back to me, as if searching for a clue I had not given. Mark exhaled sharply and stepped back, muttering under his breath. I walked slowly across the porch to the edge of the garden, planting my hands gently on my hips. Here is what we will do, I said, my voice gaining clarity and authority with every word. You will leave the paperwork for me to review at my own pace. I will consult with my attorney, and you will not interfere until I am ready. This is not negotiable. Ethan looked up, smiling quietly at my decisiveness. Mark opened his mouth and then closed it again, the stubborn line of his jaw softening for the first time. Linda's lips parted slightly as if she was about to protest, then closed again, caught in the undeniable firmness of my stance. The day progressed slowly, with tension hovering in the air but unspoken. Mark and Linda went about their routines, but the energy they carried was different, less certain, more tentative. I focused on the garden, tending to the plants with care, speaking to Ethan in quiet tones about soil, water, and patience. Each small lesson, each careful adjustment, reinforced the reality that life could continue on my terms. The house was still mine, the property still held by my name, and my voice, which had been ignored for too long, carried weight now simply because it was unwavering. Late that afternoon, a letter arrived from my attorney. The envelope was plain, unassuming, but it contained the reassurance I needed. I opened it carefully, reading each line and committing the details to memory. My attorney had reviewed my existing documents, noted potential areas of concern, and outlined the steps necessary to protect my property and rights. I tucked the letter safely into my desk drawer, feeling the first real sense of security I had known in weeks. Ethan peered over my shoulder, eyes curious but respectful. "Everything okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "Yes, baby. Everything is okay. We're just making sure the house stays ours." He smiled and returned to the marigolds, understanding the balance of patience and preparation without needing further explanation. The following days continued with subtle shifts in household dynamics. Mark and Linda attempted small interventions, offering help or guidance in ways that now seemed hollow. I listened, responded minimally, and acted decisively when necessary, always maintaining the quiet authority that had begun to grow around me. It was a delicate balance, a dance of power and patience where every action had meaning and every word was measured. Outside, the neighborhood remained unaware of the unfolding struggle, the quiet resistance that was slowly reshaping the home from within. Inside, I watched my son and his wife realize that control was not as simple as they had assumed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the porch, Ethan and I sat quietly on the steps. "Do you think they'll understand?" he asked, a hint of worry in his voice. I smiled softly, placing a hand on his small shoulder. "They'll understand when they see that I'm not someone to be ignored or dismissed," I said. "Actions speak louder than words, Ethan, and patience is one of the strongest forms of action." He nodded, seemingly comforted by the explanation, and leaned back against the wooden railing. The quiet settled around us, but this time it was not the same passive silence as before. It carried the weight of determination, the subtle but unmistakable hum of someone who had regained her footing and would not yield. The next morning, I woke to the soft chirping of birds and the faint smell of fresh dew on the grass. The sun was only just breaking over the rooftops, casting a golden light across the yard, highlighting the small garden where Ethan had spent so much of the previous day. I dressed quietly, mindful of the peaceful rhythm of the morning, and stepped outside to check on the plants. Each marigold and rose bush seemed to greet me, their leaves glistening with the new day's promise. The garden had become more than just a plot of earth. It was a symbol of resilience, of life continuing quietly, determinedly, even after disruption. Ethan was already there, kneeling beside a small bed of newly planted marigolds, his little hands patting the soil gently. "Good morning, Grandma," he said, looking up with a soft smile. I returned the smile, feeling a warmth that reminded me why all of this effort mattered. "Morning, Ethan." Looks like you've been busy. He nodded, eyes serious. I wanted to make sure the flowers are safe. You taught me to care for them slowly, not rush. I chuckled softly, impressed by his memory and attention to detail. We moved together through the garden, examining each plant carefully, discussing water, sunlight, and patience. The simple act of tending the garden had become a ritual, a way to anchor ourselves amid the tension still lingering inside the house. By mid-morning, Mark appeared on the porch again, holding his usual clipboard, his expression a mix of determination and frustration. I didn't look at him directly, choosing instead to focus on Ethan and the small trowel he was using. "Mom," Mark called, his voice tighter than ever, "we need to review the paperwork now." I took a deep breath and stood slowly, letting my presence fill the space. "Mark," I said, voice calm but firm, "there is no urgency in what is already mine. I will review everything at my own pace." Ethan looked up at me, sensing the strength in my tone. Mark's jaw tightened, the usual confidence he carried faltering slightly under the quiet authority radiating from me. Linda stepped out behind him, attempting to maintain her composed, concerned demeanor. "Martha, you're being difficult again," she said, voice clipped. I smiled faintly, acknowledging the effort without yielding. Perhaps I am simply being careful. Careful is better than blind compliance. Her eyes flicked to Ethan, noting the boy's silent participation in our quiet resistance, then back to me, as if searching for a clue. Mark exhaled sharply and stepped back, muttering under his breath, realizing that the familiar tactics of control were failing. I watched them both, understanding that the perception of weakness they had held for so long was beginning to shift. Afterward, I retreated to the kitchen, carrying a small basket of freshly picked herbs and flowers. Ethan followed, placing the marigolds in a vase while I began brewing tea. The simple acts of preparing the morning, together arranging flowers, pouring water, stirring gently became a quiet ceremony, a reaffirmation of the life and energy that still pulsed through our home. I spoke softly to Ethan, sharing stories from my own childhood, tales of resilience and determination, lessons meant to guide him in ways that went beyond words. He listened intently, absorbing the knowledge like a sponge, the innocence of his age blending with a growing understanding of how strength can manifest quietly. Late that afternoon, I received a call from my attorney, Monica Reeves. She updated me on the progress of the legal protections we had set in motion. Every detail had been accounted for, every potential loophole addressed. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was tempered by the awareness that true control was not just legal. It was behavioral, psychological, and persistent. I explained the details to Ethan, carefully framing it so he understood without becoming overwhelmed. "See, baby," I said, "it's not just about papers or signatures. It's about making sure our home stays ours and our lives stay in our control." He nodded solemnly, placing a small hand on mine, the gesture solidifying our unspoken bond of trust and determination. The days that followed were filled with small victories, quiet tests of patience and restraint. Mark and Linda attempted minor interventions, offering help with chores, suggesting small compromises, but each attempt was met with measured responses. I listened carefully, answered calmly, and acted deliberately, reinforcing that control was no longer theirs to assume. Ethan continued his duties in the garden, tending plants with careful hands, showing me that he too had internalized the lessons of patience and quiet strength. The house, once a space of tension and uncertainty, began to settle into a new rhythm, one dictated not by fear or coercion, but by the quiet assertion of what was rightfully ours. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the porch and garden, Ethan and I sat quietly together. "Do you think they understand yet?" he asked, a trace of worry in his voice. I smiled gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "They will, baby. Not because of words, but because of actions. Patience, persistence, and quiet determination speak louder than any argument." He leaned back against the railing, comforted by my words, the soft evening air wrapping around us like a protective cloak. The tension of the household was still present, but now it was tempered by a growing understanding that control was no longer assumed by the wrong people. By the end of that week, the subtle shifts in household dynamics became even more apparent. Mark and Linda were less assertive, their movements and words measured, uncertain. The balance of power had begun to shift irreversibly. I focused on continuing the quiet routines, tending to the garden, speaking softly with Ethan, and reinforcing the lessons of patience and resilience. Each day was a deliberate act of reclamation, a step towards solidifying the authority and presence that had long been underestimated. I began to see that strength is often invisible at first glance, quiet and patient, waiting for the right moment to assert itself fully. Late one afternoon, as the golden light of the setting sun poured into the living room, I found myself reflecting on the journey so far. The house, once a source of tension and manipulation, had become a sanctuary of strategy and quiet victory. Ethan sat beside me, flipping through a photo album, his eyes bright with curiosity and understanding. "Grandma," he said softly, "I think we're finally safe here." I nodded, the weight of that realization settling over me like a warm blanket. "Yes, baby, we're safe. And we're not just safe, we're in control. That is the difference." I could see the comprehension in his young face, the subtle glow of understanding that patience, resilience, and quiet assertiveness could achieve what confrontation never could. The next morning, the sunlight filtered softly through the kitchen curtains, casting warm stripes across the worn wooden floor. I stood by the counter, carefully arranging a plate of freshly baked muffins, the aroma filling the room with a comforting familiarity. Ethan sat at the small table, his hands wrapped around a mug of cocoa, eyes bright with curiosity. "Grandma," he asked, "do you think they'll ever realize we weren't weak?" I paused, considering the question, and then smiled gently. "Some lessons take time, baby. They'll see eventually. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, and it grows while the world is distracted." He nodded, absorbing the words, a quiet understanding settling in his young face. The morning felt like a gentle affirmation that the tides were turning in our favor. Outside, the garden awaited our attention. Each flower, each carefully tended bed, had become a testament to perseverance. Ethan and I moved slowly among the rows, checking soil moisture, trimming leaves, and planting new seeds. "You know, Grandma," he said thoughtfully, "I think this garden is teaching me patience more than anything else." I chuckled softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Exactly, baby. Life is much like this garden. You can't force growth. You can't rush the bloom. You nurture it, care for it, and eventually it thrives." His small hands dug into the earth, a rhythm forming between us, our movements quiet but purposeful. Each action was a reinforcement of our reclaimed space and authority in a household that had once tried to silence us. By mid-morning, Mark approached the porch, clipboard in hand, hesitating at the top of the steps. I continued tending the plants, letting the rustle of leaves and the scent of marigolds establish a calm boundary. "Mom," he said cautiously, "we need to talk about the financial statements." I didn't look at him immediately, allowing the soft rustling of leaves to convey my patience. "Mark," I said finally, voice calm but firm, "we will discuss finances when it is convenient for those who have lived through them, not for those who think urgency is a tool of control." He flushed slightly, a mix of frustration and realization passing across his face. It was clear that the power dynamics had shifted, that the assumption of weakness he had relied on for so long was no longer valid. Linda followed behind him, attempting to maintain an air of concern, but her usual confidence faltered. "Martha, you're making this unnecessarily difficult," she said, voice sharp. I placed the watering can down deliberately, meeting her gaze evenly. "Perhaps, or perhaps I am simply exercising the right to decide what is mine, on my terms." Her eyes flicked to Ethan, who continued carefully planting seeds without a word, observing silently, absorbing every detail of the unfolding dynamics. Mark exhaled sharply, realizing that coercion would not succeed here. The quiet authority we had cultivated spoke louder than any argument or demand could. Afterward, I let Ethan back inside, carrying a small basket of herbs and flowers for the kitchen. We arranged the marigolds in a vase, their bright petals standing in contrast to the tension that had lingered in the house for months. Ethan's small hands worked meticulously, showing the care he had internalized from our shared moments in the garden. I began brewing tea, letting the warm steam rise, filling the room with a gentle sense of comfort and control. "Grandma," he said softly, "I think we're learning more than just gardening." I nodded, smiling. "Yes, baby, We're learning patience, strategy, and how quiet strength can change everything. His eyes lit with understanding, the innocence of youth blending seamlessly with an emerging comprehension of resilience and personal authority. Later that afternoon, a letter arrived, carefully slid under the door. I picked it up, recognizing the familiar handwriting from our attorney, Monica Reeves. I opened it slowly, savoring the moment, knowing it contained updates on the final legal protections that would solidify our claim to the house and our independence. Ethan watched with anticipation as I read, explaining the contents in simple terms so he understood the implications without becoming overwhelmed. "See, baby," I said, "this is the part where patience and preparation pay off. We don't just fight with anger, we fight with planning, knowledge, and foresight." He nodded thoughtfully, understanding that true strength was multifaceted and often invisible until it manifested fully. The following days became a rhythm of quiet assertion. Mark and Linda attempted minor interventions, suggesting tasks or offering assistance, but each approach was met with careful, deliberate responses. I listened, considered, and acted in ways that reinforced our authority over our home and lives. Ethan continued his duties in the garden, tending each plant with care, his actions a reflection of the lessons he had internalized. The house, once a place of tension and manipulation, began to breathe with a new energy, one of deliberate calm and persistent presence. Our quiet victories were piling up, unnoticed by most, but powerful in their cumulative effect. One evening, as the sun began to set and painted the sky in shades of gold and orange, Ethan and I sat together on the porch. The air was warm, carrying the scent of marigolds and fresh earth. "Grandma," he said softly, "I think they're starting to understand. Maybe not everything, but some things." I placed my hand over his small one, squeezing gently. "They'll understand eventually, baby, not because of words, but because of actions. The truth has a way of revealing itself when you let it breathe." He leaned back against the railing, comforted by the wisdom in my tone, the quiet assurance that strength is often unseen until it becomes undeniable. The garden, the house, the routine, it was all working silently but powerfully in our favor. By the end of the week, the subtle changes in the household were undeniable. Mark's tone softened, his attempts at control becoming less frequent and more cautious. Linda's usual certainty wavered, replaced by hesitations and careful measurements. The shift was gradual but steady. I focused on maintaining the calm, ensuring that every action was deliberate, reinforcing the authority and presence we had fought so hard to reclaim. Each day became a reaffirmation of quiet resilience, patience, and thoughtful strategy. The garden flourished alongside our renewed sense of control, a living symbol of persistence and quiet strength. Late one afternoon, as the golden light bathed the living room in warmth, I reflected on how far we had come. The house, once a site of manipulation and anxiety, had transformed into a sanctuary of strategy and subtle victory. Ethan sat beside me, flipping through photographs, asking questions about family and history, his curiosity growing alongside his understanding of the lessons I had been teaching. "Grandma," he said, "I feel like we're finally free here." I nodded, letting the weight of that realization settle in. "Yes, baby, we are free, but freedom comes with responsibility. We protect it, nurture it, and never take it for granted." He looked thoughtful, grasping the importance of these lessons in ways that were beyond his years. The next morning, sunlight streamed gently through the windows, painting the living room in gold. I poured a cup of jasmine tea, the aroma curling into every corner, and set it beside me on the table. Ethan shuffled into the room, yawning and rubbing his eyes. "Grandma," he said sleepily, "do you think they'll ever really understand what they did?" I paused, considering the weight of his question. "Some lessons take years, baby," I said softly. "Sometimes people have to live through their mistakes before they truly see the truth." He nodded slowly, absorbing my words, his small hands clutching the mug I offered him. The quiet of the morning, broken only by the occasional bird outside, felt like a fragile sanctuary in a world that had once tried to crush our spirit. After breakfast, we stepped outside into the garden. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, their colors vibrant against the deep green of the leaves. Ethan carried a small watering can, trailing behind me as I moved from bed to bed, checking the soil and tending to each plant. "Grandma, I think this garden makes me feel strong," he said, sprinkling water carefully. I smiled, brushing a loose strand of hair from my forehead. That's exactly it, baby. Strength grows quietly, without anyone noticing. It isn't about showing off. It's about survival, patience, and care. He looked up at me, eyes wide, absorbing the lesson. Each flower, each new sprout, was a testament to our resilience, a living reminder that what had been attempted against us could not break our spirit. Later, a knock echoed softly at the front door. I wiped my hands on my apron before opening it, finding a neighbor holding a small basket of fresh fruit. "We heard about everything that happened," she said quietly, eyes full of empathy. "We wanted to make sure you had a little something for the week." I accepted the basket, offering a small smile of gratitude. Ethan peeked from behind me, curious and quiet. "See, baby," I whispered. "People notice the truth even when it's quiet. Sometimes the world can't ignore integrity forever." He nodded, eyes flicking between the neighbor and me, understanding that our endurance was not only about us, it irradiated outward, inspiring others in subtle ways. By midday, Mark came again, attempting to assert control under the guise of concern. "Mom, we need to discuss the house repairs," he said, clipboard in hand. I leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, maintaining an air of calm authority. "Mark," I said firmly, "repairs happen when they are necessary, not when someone thinks urgency will override patience. I manage this house on my terms." He hesitated, frustration and realization flashing across his face. Ethan stood silently beside me, observing, internalizing the lesson. Quiet strength does not need to be shouted. It needs to be consistent, deliberate, and unwavering. Mark finally nodded, recognizing that his assumptions of weakness no longer held power over us. Linda followed closely behind, her voice sharp as she tried to intervene. "Martha, you're making this difficult," she said, attempting to maintain control. I met her gaze steadily, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder to signal unity. "Perhaps, or perhaps I am simply protecting what is mine," I said calmly. "You may have thought you could erase me, but what belongs to me remains untouched." Her eyes darted to Ethan, realizing that she was witnessing not just my resolve, but the values being instilled in the next generation. Every movement, every word reinforced the quiet authority we had reclaimed, and it was clear that any attempts at manipulation would now be met with deliberate resistance. As the afternoon settled, I led Ethan inside to arrange the flowers we had picked earlier. The bright petals contrasted sharply with the lingering tension from recent weeks, infusing the room with life and warmth. "Grandma, I feel like we're finally in control here," he said, placing a marigold carefully in a vase. I nodded, smiling softly. "Yes, baby. Control isn't always about shouting or proving dominance. Sometimes it's about patience, strategy, and knowing when to act." Ethan's small hands worked carefully, internalizing lessons of resilience, foresight, and quiet victory. Together, we created not just a physical sanctuary, but a psychological one, where strength was demonstrated through consistency, patience, and care. By evening, the house hummed with quiet activity. Ethan and I baked bread, the warm scent of yeast and sugar filling every corner. We laughed softly over small mistakes, each moment reinforcing the bond that had grown stronger in the face of betrayal. "Grandma," he said, sprinkling flour over the counter, "I think being patient can be more powerful than being loud." I smiled, brushing flour from his hair. "Exactly, baby. People often underestimate the quiet ones. They don't see the plans being laid, the strength being built. But when it matters, the truth reveals itself." The warmth of the kitchen, combined with the knowledge of regained control, created a profound sense of peace. We were no longer reacting. We were orchestrating, guiding our lives with deliberate care. The following morning, a new letter arrived from our attorney, Monica Reeves. I opened it carefully, savoring the moment, knowing it contained confirmation that our legal protections had been finalized. Ethan watched intently as I read, explaining the details in terms he could understand. "See, baby," I said, "strength is built on action, preparation, and knowledge. We don't just wait for justice, we create it." He nodded thoughtfully, realizing that our victories were not only emotional but also practical. Every step we had taken, every patient move, had solidified our authority, ensuring that no one could take what we had reclaimed. Days passed in a rhythm of quiet assertion. Mark and Linda's attempts to intervene were met with calm, deliberate responses. Ethan continued tending the garden, reinforcing lessons of care, patience, and resilience. The house, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now exuded quiet power. Each day was a subtle victory, reinforcing our position, reminding everyone involved that assumptions of weakness were no longer valid. The space we had reclaimed was both physical and psychological, a testament to the strength that comes from preparation, patience, and unwavering resolve. As the sun set on a particularly warm afternoon, Ethan and I sat on the porch sipping tea. The garden glowed with golden light, a testament to the care and attention we had poured into it. "Grandma," he said softly, "do you think they really understand now?" I shook my head slightly, smiling. "Maybe not fully, baby. Some lessons take a lifetime to understand. But we've done what matters. We've shown that strength isn't always loud, and that patience and preparation can move mountains." He nodded, content in the knowledge that our quiet power had shifted the world around us in ways that were subtle but undeniable. By the end of the week, small changes in behavior became apparent. Mark's tone softened, Linda's confidence faltered, and the house itself seemed lighter, freer. The garden flourished, mirroring our regained control. Ethan continued his duties, internalizing lessons of resilience and strategic patience. Each day reinforced the subtle but undeniable shift in power, illustrating that real strength often works in silence, building quietly until it becomes impossible to ignore. Our victories were deliberate, cumulative, and deeply satisfying. The final week in our new rhythm felt like a gentle awakening. Mornings began with sunlight spilling across the porch, highlighting the blooms in the garden and glinting off the freshly washed windows. I sipped my tea slowly, savoring the warmth, the aroma, and the feeling that at last everything was settling into place. Ethan joined me, carrying a small notebook he had begun using to record his own observations, dreams, and lessons he had learned from the events that had unfolded. "Grandma," he said softly, "I think I'm starting to understand more about people. About patience, about strength." I nodded, my heart swelling with quiet pride. "That's right, baby. Sometimes the quietest hearts are the loudest when it counts." The house felt alive in a way it hadn't for years. Each room held memories of struggle, triumph, and now, calm. I walked through the halls, touching the walls, noticing the way light shifted in the morning, the soft creak of the wooden floor underfoot, the comforting smell of clean linen. Everything was familiar, yet different, freer, lighter, as if the house itself had exhaled in relief. Ethan followed, asking questions about the old photos on the shelves, about the stories I had once told him in bits and pieces. "Tell me again about how you managed when Mom and Dad," he began. I smiled gently. "We'll start from the beginning, baby, but remember, what matters most is how we respond to life, not what life throws at us." In the afternoons, we spent hours in the garden, tending to new flowers and vegetables. The marigolds had grown taller, roses bloomed in red and gold, and tomatoes were ripening steadily on their vines. Ethan's enthusiasm was contagious, and his small hands worked with care and patience, sprinkling water and checking the soil. "Grandma," he said, "I think this garden teaches me more than any book ever could." I leaned down, brushing dirt from his cheek. "Exactly, baby. Life is like this garden. You plant seeds, care for them patiently, and eventually the rewards come. Strength grows in the quiet moments, not the noisy ones." Each bloom became a symbol of resilience, a living testament to the lessons of patience, foresight, and deliberate care we had internalized. Evenings were calm, often spent in quiet reflection. I would sit by the window, watching the soft glow of streetlights illuminate the yard, listening to the hum of life around us. Ethan sometimes joined me with a sketchbook, drawing the garden, the house, or sometimes just the feeling of peace he saw in me. "Grandma," he whispered one night, "do you think they will ever really understand what they tried to do?" I took his small hand in mine, squeezing gently. "Maybe, baby. Maybe not. But that isn't the point. The point is that we survived. We reclaimed what was ours, and we learned that strength and peace are far more important than proving someone else wrong. He nodded, the weight of the lesson sinking in slowly, deeply, quietly. One afternoon, Monica Reeves called to check in on our progress and update us on the final legal documentation. "Everything is in order," she said, her voice steady and warm. "Your estate, the trust for Tyler, and the Mayfield legacy grant are all finalized. You're protected, and your legacy is secure." I exhaled slowly, a weight lifting from my shoulders. "Thank you, Monica," I said, feeling gratitude for the woman who had guided us through the storm. Ethan peeked around the corner, listening intently. "Grandma, that means we don't have to worry anymore." I smiled. "Exactly, baby. We've prepared, we fought smart, and now we can live freely." It was a moment of quiet victory, a culmination of weeks of deliberate action, careful planning, and unwavering patience. As the days passed, small moments of reflection reinforced our understanding of what had occurred. Ethan would ask questions about the past, about Jason, about Danielle, about the choices people make. I answered honestly but gently, focusing on lessons rather than blame. "People sometimes make terrible mistakes," I told him, "but that doesn't mean we carry their mistakes as our burden. We protect ourselves, we protect those we love, and we continue to grow, no matter what." He nodded, internalizing not just the practical knowledge, but the moral and emotional lessons embedded in every story I told. The garden, the house, and our lives became a living classroom, teaching resilience, patience, and self-respect. The community noticed the change as well. Neighbors waved as we walked past, some stopping to ask for advice on their own gardens, or to share quiet words of support. The local church reached out, inviting me to speak again about elder rights, resilience, and the importance of standing firm in the face of betrayal. I agreed, seeing it as another opportunity to extend the lessons we had learned beyond our walls. Ethan listened as I practiced, helping me select words that would resonate with the audience, his small hand steadying mine. "Grandma, people need to hear this," he said softly. "They need to know they aren't alone." I nodded, grateful that even the youngest observer could understand the weight and power of our story. In the evenings, Tyler, our grandson, continued to spend more time with us. He had grown calmer, more confident, and more aware of the world around him. Together we cooked meals, played cards, and laughed over shared memories. He began to learn the importance of patience, careful observation, and deliberate action, not through lectures but through example. Every small moment reinforced the central lesson: strength is not always raw. Sometimes it sits quietly, carefully, and waits for the right moment to assert itself. Tyler's growth was a living proof that the legacy of resilience could be passed down, nurtured, and protected. As the week drew to a close, I sat with Ethan on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange, pink, and purple. "Grandma," he said softly, leaning against me, "I think I understand now. Strength isn't about yelling or fighting. It's about surviving, planning, and standing firm when no one is looking." I smiled, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Exactly, baby. And never forget that your peace, your quiet power, is more valuable than any argument, any grudge, or any loud confrontation. True strength is calm, deliberate, and unstoppable." He nodded, eyes reflecting the fading light, absorbing not just my words, but the essence of what we had built together: resilience, respect, and quiet victory. That night, after Ethan had gone to bed, I sat alone on the porch, tea in hand, watching the stars emerge one by one. The house next door was silent, empty of the chaos that had once plagued us. Jason and Danielle were gone, their attempts at control long behind us. The roses I had planted glowed faintly in the moonlight, a silent reminder of every victory, every patient action, and every lesson learned. I breathed deeply, letting the cool night air wash over me, feeling the profound peace that comes from reclaiming control, protecting family, and standing firm in the truth. The storm had passed, but the calm that followed was sweeter than I had ever imagined. I reflected on everything that had happened: the betrayal, the isolation, the quiet planning, and the final reclamation of our home, our peace, and our dignity. Strength had been tested in every form: emotional, legal, practical, and moral. Yet, through patience, intelligence, and a refusal to yield, we had emerged victorious. Ethan's presence, Tyler's growth, and the support of friends and neighbors reminded me that our legacy was not defined by those who had tried to harm us, but by the resilience and love we nurtured in its place. Peace, patience, and quiet authority had become our shield and our reward. As I closed my eyes that night, I thought of the future, a future filled with calm mornings, productive afternoons, and peaceful evenings on the porch. Ethan would continue to learn, Tyler would continue to grow, and our story would live on. Not as a tale of revenge, but as a testament to the power of quiet strength, deliberate action, and enduring love. The house, the garden, and the memories we had created were now ours entirely, free from intrusion or manipulation. And for the first time in weeks, I felt wholly unburdened, completely safe, and beautifully in control of my own life.